After years of delays and billions of dollars worth of overspending, SLS and Artemis 1 is almost ready to take flight, less than 2 months away from launch if NASA is to be believed. And after looking at beautiful views like this, I have to admit it's difficult to not get excited about the prospects of this rocket taking to flight and us finally returning to the moon. But as I've talked about many times in the past, this is not the rocket that's going to really get us to the moon to stay. There simply is no way to make this rocket sustainable for the long run, establishing a permanent presence on the lunar surface. So what does that mean? What can NASA do to change this scenario to where we actually will go back to the moon to stay? Well, it would appear that all NASA is doing right now is doubling down on SLS. This is the fuel tank for Artemis 2, and it is well on its way towards completion and heading toward its planned flight sometime in 2023 or 2024. This will actually be a manned mission which will either orbit the moon, or if we're lucky, there will be a space station in place for the astronauts to stay on for a while until they actually return, although it's more likely that they're just going to orbit the moon in the Orion. And this is only just the beginning of what's going on with the SLS program. Billions of dollars are still being sunk into this expendable and outdated rocket, and they're even talking about missions as late as Artemis 9. Towards the end of this month, NASA will be testing the FSB-2, or the Flight Support Booster 2, which is little more than an upgraded version of the solid rocket boosters that were used to power the shuttle. It has 5 segments instead of 4, and on top of that, it has a variety of improvements designed to provide more thrust, more reliable thrust, and more efficient thrust. The goal is to get to a maximum of thrust of 3.6 million pounds per solid rocket booster, and these boosters will not be used for Artemis 1, 2, or 3, but rather for Artemis 4 and for the Block 1B, which means money is already being spent on tangible products for an Artemis 4 mission, and therefore a 4th SLS. So really, it would appear that NASA is putting all of their eggs into the SLS basket still, and Administrator Nelson definitely seems to be supporting that school of thought. Quote, "There's only one rocket that's ready to launch, our SLS, and the Orion space capsule at its tip is also the only vehicle in which the crew can survive the return to Earth. At some point, Elon Musk would like to be able to do the same with his Starship, but we have to deal with the practical here and now. So if we're stuck with this damn thing, at least until maybe the end of the decade, then how do we make it work with Artemis? How do we create a sustainable program with such a wasteful and expensive rocket? We're gonna find all that out in just a moment. So the first question is, does Administrator Nelson actually have a point? Well, to a degree, he does, because here's the primary propulsion system of SLS tested well over a year ago.
And all personnel, we've got engine start, and we're into the plus count. All personnel, please continue to monitor your systems and grasp. 7.
And the solid rocket boosters, which provide over 75% of the thrust.
1. Fire.
And here's where we are with Starship. And before you get your torches and pitchforks out, I need to emphasize that I don't believe that SLS is going to be superior to Starship in the long run, but it's important to note that Starship in its current iteration is not a complete rocket, not even close. It is an early version prototype. In fact, some argue that it isn't a prototype at all, that lots of things still need to be added to this rocket before anybody would even consider it to be prepared to be human rated. There are many steps that Starship has to go through before it can even conceivably carry human beings, not least of which is a comprehensive life support system far more ambitious than what currently exists on Crew Dragon. That alone is going to take a lot of time, whereas SLS has gone through all of the paces at this point, including a full-fledged wet rehearsal, which you're watching right now. All of the necessary engine gimbaling, although that's one of the basic things. On top of that, all of the necessary subsystems in the booster, in the ICPS, the Orion, and everything that connects the systems together, plus all of the umbilicals that hook the rocket onto the mobile launch tower. So many things that this rocket has gone through up to this point in order to be considered flight ready and capable of carrying humans. And even this isn't going to be enough for NASA, of course. They're going to send this ship on an unmanned mission just to make sure everything's working properly, especially the life support system. Starship is nowhere close to that, and theoretically, it's supposed to be at that point by 2025, which is incredibly ambitious in my opinion. 3 years from now, Starship is supposed to go from where it is at the moment to a fully human-rated vessel that will be capable of carrying astronauts from the Lunar Gateway or from the Orion down to the lunar surface. That's going to be a very tough prospect, to say the least, whereas SLS is pretty much ready to do the job that it's supposed to do. Assuming everything with Artemis 1 goes smoothly, then SLS will be able to fling one Orion capsule after another all the way to cislunar space, where the HLS system is supposed to take over. I've talked extensively about how bad this plan is and how underfunded the HLS program is, how unlikely, in my opinion, it's going to be for Starship to be ready by 2025, especially with the relatively small amount of funding that it's getting. This entire plan has lots of problems. And as much as I hate to say it, aside from the expense, SLS may become one of the least of those problems if it proves to be effective. Yes, it's going to be expensive, but if it turns out that SLS can indeed propel the Orion out to cislunar space to rendezvous with the Gateway reliably time after time, then this is a reliable part of Artemis, and this is going to take care of a big piece of the puzzle. And so, Administrator Nelson may have a point. We need to deal with the practical here and now, and if SLS proves to be a practical solution of getting humans from Earth out to cislunar space, then why not go with this practical solution, assuming that you have the money? And Starship is going to be significantly more complicated than SLS in terms of its infrastructure. I've talked about that before as well. It's not just a matter of propelling a gigantic rocket all the way out to cislunar space. You also have to refuel it many times in low Earth orbit before it can make the rest of the journey. That may prove to be a far more difficult engineering task than Elon is anticipating, and it could delay Starship's implementation for several years, perhaps all the way to the end of the decade. It's really difficult to predict because with Starship, we are treading on unknown ground, and I'm really not very happy that they only selected one HLS provider. If the Starship setup proves to be too difficult or too impractical to implement, then we are stuck. Artemis is stuck until a second HLS provider can be found, and that could take a very long time. The earliest that anyone could provide an alternative to Lunar Starship is 2027 or 2028, so Starship really needs to succeed, even though the task of making it succeed is a very steep hill indeed, and one that we have never climbed before. Starship is going to seriously test the limits of rocket science. We have never tried to put together a propulsion system with 33 engines and make it work, and one was the last rocket to attempt that, and of course we know how that turned out for the Soviets. On top of that, we've never tried low Earth orbit refueling, especially on a vast scale. There are so many things that are groundbreaking with Starship, not least of which is reusability. Also, we can't be certain how reusability is going to work out with such a massive rocket. There are lots of unknowns with Starship, and that's one of the reasons why NASA really doesn't have a choice but to stick with SLS until Starship really proves itself. And here's another factor that SLS advocates like to talk about: the cost. As much as we talk about the expense of this rocket, it's actually less than just about every other major rocket system that NASA ever developed. Less expensive than Saturn I, significantly less expensive than the Space Shuttle, and much, much less expensive than Saturn V. $66 billion in adjusted money as far as Saturn V is concerned. If we had the same kinds of budgetary constraints today, back in the 1960s, the Soviets would have definitely beaten us to the moon, hands down. So here's the point I'm trying to make. Is Starship the rocket of the future? Yes, absolutely. Is reusability and low Earth orbit refueling the only way that we're going to be able to affordably colonize the solar system and maintain a permanent presence on the moon? Yes, absolutely. But in the meantime, SLS does have capabilities that will allow it to be a stopgap rocket to handle a lot of Artemis's requirements, including heavy lift. If you have a look at the Block 2 cargo version at the end of SLS Evolution, it's actually pretty impressive. An 8.4 meter fairing with a long fairing option up to 90 feet long. This is actually significantly longer than the Starship's fairing is. In the long run, SLS will be able to carry the same kind of cargo, at least as far as volume is concerned, that Starship can without any refueling. However, the expense is going to make it completely impractical. So the only reason, of course, that you would ever do this is if Starship is having difficulties with implementation. But that is my point. SLS can do the job that it has to do for Artemis until Starship is truly ready, assuming, of course, that Congress is willing to spend the money on the damn thing. But at the moment, they seem more than happy to throw money at SLS. Lots of money, because of course it provides lots of jobs. So here's the solution, and this is going to be highly controversial, but here's the solution for Artemis until Starship is firmly established, human-rated, and functional. They're going to need more SLS launches, not less. Let me say that again. They're going to need more SLS launches, and they're going to need the budget for it, and let me explain why. One SLS launch per year puts a crew on the Lunar Gateway for about 45 days, with a small period of time reserved for deployment on the lunar surface. Perhaps 90 days with some of the later versions of the Artemis missions. That's not enough. Not nearly enough. It's not going to be enough to justify the expense of this damn program, the expense of SLS, and everything else associated with it. We're going back to the moon to stay. Therefore, we're going to require at least 2 SLS launches per year, and also a plan to keep these astronauts on the Lunar Gateway for at least 3 to 6 months for a variety of different reasons. Obviously, you can do a lot more during that time frame, but also you're trying to simulate missions to Mars. You can't simulate that in 45 days or even 90 days. It needs to be a 6-month mission. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, there are ways to accomplish this. There are all sorts of countries, the ESA, the Japanese Space Agency, and others who are interested in participating in Artemis any way they can. The most constructive contribution they could make to Artemis would be to resupply the gateway. Both the Japanese and the Europeans are going to have that capability very soon, on top of the Falcon Heavy and its resupply missions that have already been scheduled, on top of the Dream Chaser and the Shooting Star module, which is also capable of Lunar Gateway resupply missions. All of these different launch providers are capable of keeping a mission on the Lunar Gateway supplied and maintained for a 6-month time frame. So why the hell do you want to restrict it to 45 days and put the whole program in a state of jeopardy? If you have astronauts on the Gateway the entire time, it's going to be a lot more difficult to cancel the program. But that's not the only motivation. The other motivations, of course, are, as I said before, simulating a mission to Mars and carrying out a wide variety of experiments that you're going to need to do on the Lunar Gateway that you can't do on the ISS. The environment on the Gateway is substantially different than you have on the ISS, simply because that space station is protected by the Earth's magnetic field, whereas the Lunar Gateway will not, and is a better simulator for interplanetary missions. Therefore, there is a huge number of different applications that can be carried out on the Gateway, and you need more time and more than 1 mission a year in order to get all of this work done and to justify the entire program. So what's it going to take in order to make all of this happen? Well, 1 extra SLS mission per year would probably cost an additional $3 or $4 billion. What I'm advocating is an extra $10 billion a year in funding to NASA. Oh, that sounds like such a tremendous amount of money. It is a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of funding that other governmental agencies receive. An extra $10 billion a year would make all the difference to NASA and to the Artemis program. It would easily accommodate at least 1 and possibly 2 additional missions out to the moon every year and all the benefits that come with it. It would allow us to expand our presence on the lunar surface far more rapidly, and given how quickly the Chinese are accelerating their program, I have a feeling that's something we're definitely going to need. So, if you're an American citizen, contact your congressman, contact your senator. If you're living outside the U.S., contact the White House and let them know that NASA needs additional support if we really want to return to the moon to stay, or if we just want a pale shadow of what Apollo basically was that's ultimately doomed to cancellation, that we can just keep going the way we are until we ultimately fail. Obviously, that's something that we don't want to have happen, and we can avoid it with SLS until Starship is ready to go into service. Once it enters service, that obviously changes everything. It changes how frequently you can send astronauts out to the moon. It changes how quickly we can get to Mars. It will transform the entire space industry, and this can be accomplished with SpaceX's help, of course, if we have a more robustly funded Artemis program. An extra $10 billion, some of which is allocated to additional SLS missions, and the rest of it going to Starship to get it into service as rapidly as possible. If we truly want to go to the moon to stay, then we have to actually pay for that lofty and ambitious goal. And right now, we are spending a fraction of what was spent during the Apollo era and trying to fool ourselves into believing that somehow this is going to be enough to go to the moon to stay. I'm here to tell you that it isn't, and we need to more thoroughly support this program if it is to succeed. Smash that like, hit that subscribe. Please check out the description for various ways to support my channel. I've got a couple dozen pairs of sunglasses left, actually a little bit less than that, so thank you very much for supporting me with that new piece of merchandise and everything else that you folks do to support this channel like the awesome viewers that you are. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay angry about space!